Heim joint steering. Do you want it on your truck? Do you not want it on your truck? Is it legal? Is it illegal? Good choice, bad choice? How do you maintain it? How do you install it? How do you set these daggone jam nuts? Is it a tie rod end? Do I want a tie rod end? Let's discuss. I'm going to answer the question for you at the beginning of the video, rather than make you wait to the end and see all this information. The bottom line is you do want a spherical rod end, or Heim joint, as known by the inventor, in your vehicle. If it's a high quality part, if it's a properly chosen part, if it's bigger than the OEM tie rod end that you can replace, or more heavy duty, and if you can get away with it with your inspector. Those are the four real considerations as to whether you want this on your vehicle or not. I say inspector because some people have an inspector, and that makes them say, are they legal or not? Well, it's not so much whether they're legal or they're illegal. It's that there are laws made in certain jurisdictions and states and inspections to maintain that. Where I live, there's no inspection. No one's going to look at anything ever. A lot of places there is inspection, and they have different reasons for writing the rule. Some of them are no modifications to a vehicle steering or suspension, period. So a rod end isn't illegal, it's just they're not going to approve that. Otherwise, you might have an inspector that says, I don't like this particular part, and here's why. Some of why people say a rod end isn't safe is because if it gets loose and rattly, it can fall apart. But that's a really weak statement and argument, because the tie rod ends we took off this truck are OEM, upside down, hanging, and not only were they very loose and would fall off eventually, but I've seen a truck and been in a truck where they were loose enough they just fell off and you didn't have any steering, especially if you were doing any braking and you were in a vehicle that was completely out of control. This rod end, especially this rod end on a truck that someone cares about, is never going to fall off of here unless it is just completely junk and way out of whack. But there are still things that can be done to make it a safer arrangement. One thing that can be done, and it is often done, especially in all of our drag link situations, is a safety misalignment. It's got a large diameter end that is bigger than the hole that's in the part, so that if it did fall loose or wear out so bad that it was going to fall off, it would be caught by the safety misalignment. Keep in mind, if we're talking about an OEM tie rod end or a spherical rod end such as this one, if it's so loose that we're talking about whether it may or may not fall apart, we're talking about a horribly maintained, horrible driving vehicle that absolutely should be condemned to maintenance by the owner or the inspector. Safety misalignments is something we always use in that position, away from the knuckle or the pitman on the drag link. Why on the drag link? Well, it's because we need high misalignment on the drag link. We do not need high misalignment on the tie rod. The tie rod misaligns very little throughout its cycle of travel, and the drag link often misaligns lots through its cycle of travel of both suspension and steering. So I'll take this safety, set it up here out of the way, and this is the next piece of the puzzle. It's a high angle misalignment, but it doesn't have the safety feature of the large end. And that's what we always use in a drag link against the knuckle. There's nothing wrong with using all safeties. They're a really good part, actually. We might even do that in the future, both of these being safeties, because it gives you such a nice big flat spot against this knuckle. And there's nothing wrong with running it here, although we don't run it here, because I've never had a rod end be loose almost at all, much less anywhere in danger of falling off. Right now we don't have a nylon lock nut on here because this is not finally aligned, but when we do align it all the way, we'll have a nylon lock nut on here. So I'll go ahead and set this misalignment up here with the other safety, these two being used together, like you see there, and the total width of that is 2 inches. That's not important until we go to mount a track bar, then it's more important. This misalignment we use because it is not a high angle misalignment. Doesn't give this thing a lot of opportunity to flex or move around, but it doesn't need it. And that's what we'll use on top and bottom of a tie rod. Again, you want to pick a high angle safety misalignment, and put it right there, that's a great idea. Wouldn't hurt a thing. You can do that and be one step up on safety. So the combined width of these two particular misalignments with a rod end is 1 5/8 inches. Not important here. We don't need any more clearance than that, but it is important when we go to mount a track bar. Speaking of track bar mounting, a double shear mount, like a track bar mount, is a very safe and legal way and place to mount a rod end. Here we have a track bar bracket, double shear in nature, as opposed to this single shear setup here. Both of these, if they broke your bolt, would be able to twist on the bolt and break it off. Now, that's a 3/4 bolt ready for 300 plus foot-pounds of torque, so that's not what I'm expecting. I've never had it happen. But that's single shear mounting. This is double shear mounting. No one will complain about this, including a vehicle inspector. You got a track bar bracket conversion. I shouldn't say that. Who knows what somebody could complain about. So this is a perfect spot where you have a super strong part in a double shear mount, and you can see this track bar bracket is 2 inches wide. That's why we have a double set of high angle misalignments in there. We can really get that angle and still be riding on the center of that ball. And there are a lot of applications you can't do that. This OEM track bar bracket is also another very safe place and legal place to have a spherical rod end. And it doesn't happen to be 2 inches wide. So not only can you not run high angle misalignments, but you don't get the benefits of doing so either. So that's a great place to run it, but you're a little bit trapped. And we always increase that bolt diameter as much as we can, both in the OEM axle modified and this track bar drop bracket that we built. It is a 3/4 bolt. So this truck came with a 14 millimeter bolt, and they kept increasing in the OEM in size, and 3/4, that's the way to go, because not only would it be nice and safe and basically impossible on a vehicle without a wreck to break it, but then you can put the torque you want to it and keep any movement from happening in there that would produce maybe a tiny little clicking sound or something like that that's so common with a track bar. One of the biggest negatives to a spherical rod end where I live, where they run salt and brine on the road, is rust. This is a chromoly part, very nice, very high quality, heat treated, but Ohio brine, it's gonna rust. Now we do sell a boot that you can grease and slide over these upon installation, and it's going to keep that from being an issue. If I was running them all winter, that's what I would run. So if you opt to not run this boot, you can put on a nice heavy layer of surface tension type grease, high quality grease, and get you through the couple months of winter that you might drive where this would get a lot of salt and brine on it. That's something I do to trucks around here every once in a while. If I'm gonna drive for a month where the weather's really bad, there's gonna be salt and brine on the road, I'll smear those things, because come spring, I want them to look all pretty like this, and I don't really want to run this boot personally. But this is a great option, and I put on a lot of customers' trucks. And if you're in a place that doesn't put salt and brine on the roads, well, then they're going to look just like this for a long time, especially if they're properly lubricated. Another thing that the boots do is make it look like an OEM style part to the inspector. Now, you got a sharp inspector, he's gonna know what he's talking about. But if you got somebody that's looking your vehicle over, they might say, oh, those rubber booted rod ends or tie rod end deals are good enough to me. So it depends on where you live and who your inspector is. I think if I lived in an inspection area, I'd be figuring it out, get that set up how I needed it to be. I want a long-lasting, high-performance part, racer chosen style part, and something that is probably not going to wear out soon, but even if it is going to wear out, it's just breaking the jam nut loose and spinning another one in, as opposed to many tie rods and drag links and track bars that are replace the entire part and throw it away. On the subject of the OEM part, a OEM tie rod is a ball and socket, much like this, but it's plastic lined. And the problem is when that plastic liner gets a dent or an imperfection in it from a pothole or whatever it is, you got a part that's brand new and as junk as the one you took off that looked all greasy. I've put brand new OEM, lifetime, high quality replacement stuff on and take it to the alignment shop, and they show you there's enough slop in it that they say it needs a new part. It's a brand new part. There's no issue like that with these. All you're gonna have to do with these is lubricate them. This is something that before I would wash my truck, I would spray a lubricant penetrant on the part and let it soak. Penetrant lubricant. I'm not talking WD-40, unless you're talking the WD-40 that is a penetrant lubricant, or Howes lubricator, Triflow, Lucas penetrating oil, I believe in their can is what it's called these days. Any of those are a penetrant lubricant. Don't need it very often, but not only does it lubricate the inside, which is self-lubricating anyways, you don't need it. It's gonna keep it quiet, keep it from any squeaks or groans, which really don't have an issue with anyways, but that's good also to keep that metal from rusting. So a little bit of a metal protectant like those products I just listed is a good way to keep them looking pretty like they are right now. So this discussion is going to lead us to how to adjust them. Obviously you're seeing the general layout we use, but you're going to be able to see how to adjust them. Now, if you could grab a hold of your OEM part and move it, it would move a lot like that. It's just got a boot on the end, and normally when you grab it, it's a lot stiffer than that. Not stiffer like it actually works different, just has more resistance to you moving that around. But it's perfectly good for those to be able to move. In fact, they have to be able to move to go through their cycle of travel. How do you adjust them? Well, you need to make sure they never bind. So right now on this truck, we have this tie rod hanging as low as possible because at full compression, it will come extremely close to this pitman arm. So if I were to have it up higher and we hit a big bump, it came in contact with the pitman, not only would it screw the powder up a little bit, but then it might even be able to knock a jam nut loose. So that's why we have this sag. I say sag, you can see how it's hanging down as if gravity were pulling it down. There's no way I could make this stay up, it's going down. Anytime you are installing custom steering or custom suspension and moving things around, it's nice to know what your clearances are, when something hits something and why. So full lock, can you achieve it? Full compression, can you achieve it? Full lock at full compression, maybe you can achieve it, but can you even fit your tires in your fender wells at that height and under that circumstance? When you're adjusting your axle forward by means of adjustable control arms or a long arm radius arm or a long 4-link arm to restore lost wheelbase with lift, it changes things a little bit. It puts your tie rod a little bit farther forward compared to your pitman arm, or your axle a little bit farther forward compared to your track bar bracket or drop bracket. Cycling and testing are very important. The factory did that for you if you're just replacing OEM parts on an OEM vehicle. But when you're modifying, it's good to know. You'll beat your powder coat up less, you'll have less unsafe situations. We try to cover as much as we can, but being that you could have dozens of different components on this vehicle in dozens of different situations, then we can only go so far, and testing and cycling are important and smart to do. I personally would do all that stuff before powder coat too, because then you can learn all there is to learn before you beat it up. A lot of times people get a part in the mail and the first thing they do is powder coat it, and that's not my suggestion. So we adjust that by the position of the spherical rod end and then tightening the jam nut. Now this you can see is loose, so let's go ahead and put a wrench on these so you see what's doing. 13/16 wrench. It would allow you to rotate these where they need to be rotated so that they're going to comply with your adjustment. So if I was going to adjust this, I already have the other side set, but even if I was starting on the other side, I need this to be down the way gravity's going to pull it before I can snug this up. Now you can see that there is a hex tube adapter here that would allow us to put a big wrench on there, but with this fresh powder, I don't want to do it, and I almost never do. Some people want to do these against each other so that they don't do anything maybe to the Teflon lining in there, but I've never had any trouble with it, so I snug these while letting the bolt be my other wrench, if you will. So in order to do that, without this sag being misaligned from where I intended it to be, let's say you have dual steering stabilizers right here and they need to be perfectly level, then this sag becomes important because you want them to all line up. So you're gonna pick your sag against gravity. So I'll put this wrench on here, see if I can let that stay while I walk away. Yes, I've got my 1.25 inch sitting right here. So this is down right here. I've got my sag set. I'd be holding that with my hand if I didn't have a camera in my hand. But then with a little tiny snug on this jam nut, then it's gonna stay there. And I'm gonna come over here and do the exact same thing. Get that set up on there, snug this up, put a little bit on that. Now that I've done that, I don't need to put my little wrench anymore on the spherical rod end or the tube because the sag is set by having a little snug on there. Now, if you're not careful when you just go to town, you're gonna lose your sag when you go to rip on this thing some more, but you don't need to. Just put a little tiny bit more on it. Go over to the other side, same thing. Just put a little bit more on it. And if you go back and forth, you won't lose that sag. So I mentioned why we did the sag in the tie rod. It was for a particular reason. The drag link, you would do the same thing. We have certain trucks that would have enough compression that this bend needs to be pulled down on the drag link so it doesn't contact the frame on full compression. There are various reasons. Now this one's not too particular, like basically for looks. You can see that this rod end is the one that I have working against gravity. It's the one that dictates the sag or the hang. I did it in the exact same way as we just did out there on our tie rod. Hold the rod where I want, bring the rod end down like gravity will be pulling it in the future, and put a little bit of snug on there, straight down. Then I'd come back to this end and I could have it stopped at gravity. It's not quite there right now, but I don't want anything to bind up. And then on the flip side, I could rotate that rod end while leaving the tube there. I could rotate that rod end up close this way, and then it would not allow it to flop so much. Now, I've only once or twice had a customer say they hit a bump and they could tell that flop. I've never had it myself. There are other occasions when I've set these up, and because they've just got in a picky little spot, you'll get one that wants to wiggle when you go left and right. Trust me, a tiny little adjustment either way is gonna make that go away. I'm not sure exactly why it happens. I've never studied that, but you can get them in a little spot where they wanna wiggle when you take the steering wheel left and right. And of course you can't have that. We want them to be a left and right movement as soon as you crank the steering wheel. So another important subject then about rod ends is tightening your bolts. The OEM setup with the taper was very easy to tighten it enough and it stayed there and it didn't wiggle. These are a little different. We've got a straight through hole here and a bolt going through it. That needs to be really, really tight. And it's something that will probably need to be retorqued a couple of times. Same thing with these jam nuts. This jam nut is against a powder coated part. So if the powder's not removed from the end of there where the two contact, you're going to have your first step in difficulty right there. So before you install this part, not only do you grease the threads to everything here, or at least anti-seize, something like that, but you're going to take the powder off the end of the part where this nut touches. So with that step done, then you're going to tighten these down after you've gotten your alignment done. Now this is a little more work than a standard part setting your alignment, because the OEM stuff has sleeves and stuff that you can thread in and out and not have to disassemble in order to align. Now this is different. You're going to have to disassemble this stuff each adjustment when you go to align it. The good thing is it's going to be set for a super long time and you will not care anymore. So put the little bit of time in ahead of time, get this thing lined up, and you'll be glad you chose the strong, long-lasting part. Let's say you get your alignment just right. I never know if I have my alignment just right until I've taken a test drive. Every truck's different. I can get it towed to zero or just a little bit of toe in from zero, and I'll take the truck a drive and I can tell it needs a little bit more, and I'll come back for one more adjustment. So it depends on where your steering wheel's set, which one you would choose to pop loose and maybe go in a half thread. Just depends on what's going on steering wheel center wise. But when I'm all done and I'm happy, I'm going to put all the torque I can with a wrench on this. I'm going to replace that with a nylon lock nut. I'm going to put about all I can on that with a wrench, if not an impact, because these are ready for over 300 foot-pounds of torque and be safe. These 7/8 are even more. You can go like crazy on them. Then I'm going to drive it. But before that comes loose, I want to torque it again. If you get a retorque on it, then it's going to get tighter and tighter and stay that way. If you drive it until it comes loose, not only will you lose your sag and everything else and you got to start over, but the time you tighten it next is not a retorque, it's just a torque. You're gonna have to hit it again while it's still snug and get that sucker tight. That's why we mount them like we do, so straight down is the way you tighten them. And you're gonna wanna tighten them up. Retorque these probably 2 times, you're gonna wanna retorque this. If it can spin or move, or you can put any more on it, it's not tight enough. And a couple of wrenches, you know, at that size, they're pretty big wrenches. You can really put it to it, and that's what you need to do. So these boots, we're going to lubricate our rod in. So now we're lubricated there. We're going to take our zip ties. Things were going pretty good. Okay, so
the top.
It's all yeah, there you go. Ready? Yeah. So with your thumb as a helper, that thing pops on there, and that's pretty simple.
Yeah.
So that's when we get the opportunity to cut these loose and install this rod end where there's a valley right there. And then when we push that in there, this ring wants to live in that valley, stays in okay. The problem is, when we put this in, it doesn't have that same valley. In fact, when it's installed, the effective valley is down in the misalignment. So to fix that on a tie rod, or the narrow end, ready? Or the narrow end of a track bar, we are going to preload this with the parts. We're gonna go straight Ace Ventura when nature calls and install those two inside the boot. And there they live. We don't care exactly what they're doing in there because we're going to deal with that here in a second. So Justin's going to put his thumb on there just like he did last time. And we're going to work this thing on here. Of course, it's going to be a lot tighter. We got 10 times the stuff in there. We're going to work this around where we put this misalignment in the rod end, preferably without pinching any rubber. These boots are really tough, so as long as you're not using sharp instruments, they can deal with all the stretching you can put them through. And I'm looking in there easily, seeing what I'm doing. Doesn't mean it's easy, I can just easily see it. There we go. Okay, so that's popped in. Spin this around. So now that that's in there, I am not going to take the rubber over those misalignments until we have a bolt in that's ready. So ultimately, you would want to put this boot on when your alignment's almost done so that you don't have to fight this problem. And I'll even demonstrate the problem here. So if we take that over those misalignments like that, it's going to want to shove this out. That's the problem. We already have rubber wanting to go in there. We don't even have this thing situated yet. So now it's already wanting to live down in there. So I am at a pinch point on here, but not on this side. So that's where it wanted to go. It went there real easy. If I give it any slack over here, it's down in there. So these are too big of a fight to not put in there ahead of time and keep them in and tight until you're basically ready to put a bolt on. And when you put the bolt on, you want to be holding those together tight through the process so that you don't get this rubber down in this part of the misalignment. Here at Far From Stock, whether we're using a steering or a track bar or a suspension rod end, we're using 4130 Chromoly, heat-treated, self-lubricating, self-sealed. They are the best. They're the most heavy-duty thing we can possibly choose for the application, unless we just completely go oversized, and there's no point because it's a really good part. We got what you need if you can get your inspector to pass it. Heim joints. I'm looking at it. I should be looking at you guys. Me, you. That's why we have a double set of those high misalignment, high angle misalignments in there. And we get a full 2 inches of width, and we can really offset that rod end, spherical rod. It's a high misalignment. It's a high. Again, I don't know if I'm using any of this audio, but I'm going to talk myself through it anyways. Turn that over. Bear with me here. I'm going to turn over. Okay. Speaking of, I got to adjust my hat to look like a dirtbag. Haircut days tomorrow. Okay, so here at Far From Stock, whether we're using, I'm pointing at the camera, self-lubricating, I can't remember all this stuff. Up through the boots. Look at I just looped it.